Every year, thousands of newborns are abandoned across America. But in the spring of 2005, one case would defy every odd. A baby girl, less than a day old, was left to die on a blistering desert road in Arizona. Her only shelter was a cardboard box. Her only lullaby, the scorching wind. And her rescue would not come from a hospital or a police car, but from a stranger, a rancher, who heard a cry where no cry should ever be. The man who found her was a wealthy, solitary rancher named Ben Carter. His world was one of dust, cattle, and silence, stretching across 10,000 sun-baked acres. He was checking a fence line when a sound cut through the wind, not a coyote, but a human cry. What he discovered in that ditch would challenge every instinct he had and pose a single, terrifying question. In a place with no witnesses and a child with no name, what do you do when rescue is impossible and the only choice is to take her home? Ben Carter radioed for help, his voice cracking with a panic he hadn't felt in decades. But the sheriff's office was 40 miles away and the desert had other plans. A sudden, violent dust storm descended, blotting out the sun and cutting off all roads into his ranch. For the next 12 hours, the billionaire rancher was utterly alone with a dying newborn. He turned his pickup truck into a makeshift incubator, cranking the heat with one hand while cradling her with the other, feeding her drops of water from his own finger. He named her Lily right then, because the first thing he saw when the dust cleared was a patch of desert lilies pushing through the cracked earth. The storm passed, and with it any illusion of a simple rescue. When Deputy Maria Gonzalez finally arrived, she found not a scene of neglect, but one of bewildering care. Ben had converted his study into a nursery with a space heater and soft towels. The baby, Lily, was clean, wrapped, and asleep, but the law was clear. This was a case of felony abandonment and attempted homicide. The child was evidence. She had to be taken into state custody immediately, placed with a licensed emergency foster family. Ben argued, pleaded, even threatened to call his lawyers, but Maria was unmoved. As she drove away with Lily, Ben watched from his porch, the silence of his vast ranch returning, heavier and more profound than ever before. But the system moved slowly. Lily was placed with the Garcias, a kind family in Phoenix, but she failed to thrive. She refused to bottle feed, her weight dropping. Hospital tests revealed no physical cause. A court-appointed psychologist wrote a single damning line in her report: "The infant is experiencing profound grief, likely for the only caregiver she has imprinted upon." Back on the ranch, Ben was unraveling. He couldn't sleep. He fired foremen over minor mistakes. He drove back to that ditch on the road every single day. His wealth, which had always solved every problem, was useless. He was just a man who had held a life in his hands and then had to let it go. Then a break in the case. 2 weeks after the abandonment, a woman walked into the Gila Bend Sheriff's Station. She was gaunt, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling. Her name was Elena Reyes, and she confessed to being the one who left the baby. But her story was not one of cruelty. It was one of sheer, unthinkable terror. She was the child's aunt. Her sister, the baby's mother, had died in a botched, secret home birth just hours after delivery. The father was a violent man from a smuggling ring who believed the baby wasn't his. He gave Elena a choice: get rid of the problem or he would. She drove for hours, paralyzed by fear, and placed her niece in what she thought was a visible spot near a ranch, praying someone would find her before the coyotes did. With the aunt identified, a family court hearing was set. The state's goal was reunification with the next of kin, Elena. Ben Carter, using his resources, petitioned the court for emergency custody. He was not family, he was a stranger, but he argued he was the only constant the child knew. The hearing was a brutal clash of worlds. The state advocated for the sanctity of blood. Elena, through tears, begged for a chance at redemption. And Ben Carter, the cowboy billionaire, stood in a suit that didn't fit him and made a promise he couldn't legally keep. "She knows my heartbeat," he told the judge, his voice rough. "That's the only home she's ever known." Judge, a pragmatic woman named Andrea Wilkins, was unmoved by sentiment, but she was concerned by the psychological report. She issued an unprecedented ruling. Pending a full home study and criminal investigation into the father, the child would be placed in a neutral temporary location, not with the aunt, not with the rancher, but in a county group home for infants. It was a loss for everyone. As Ben left the courthouse, Elena approached him. She wasn't angry, she was defeated. "I just wanted her to live," she whispered. "I didn't know how to make that happen." For the first time, Ben saw her not as a villain, but as another victim of the same tragedy. Lily deteriorated in the group home. The caregivers were overworked, the environment sterile and loud. Her file now included the word "failure to thrive" in bold letters. Ben's home study, meanwhile, was proceeding at a glacial pace. His wealth was a red flag. Investigators questioned his motives, his solitary lifestyle, his ability to care for an infant. He was failing the test on paper. Meanwhile, the shadow of the biological father loomed. The man had been arrested on unrelated charges, but his gang had made threats. To them, the baby was a loose end. Elena, now in hiding, called Ben with a warning. "They know you tried to take her. They think you have something they want." The pressure reached its breaking point. Ben received a call from the county social worker. Lily had been hospitalized for severe dehydration. She was back in the NICU, fighting the same battle she'd fought in the desert. The doctor was blunt. She needed consistent, loving attachment to survive. The system had no immediate answer. That night, Ben Carter made a decision that would cross every legal and ethical line. He didn't call his lawyers. He didn't petition the court. He drove to the hospital, walked past the nurses, station with the authority of a man used to getting his way, and entered the sterile room where Lily lay, tiny and tethered to wires. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he began to carefully, quietly disconnect the monitors. The alarm didn't sound when he lifted her from the crib. The wires came free with a soft click, and the monitors fell silent. In the sudden quiet, Ben Carter wrapped Lily in a blanket from his truck, a faded plaid one smelling of hay and diesel, and he walked out. Not running, not hiding. He moved with the grim certainty of a man who had already lost, and so had nothing left to fear. He placed her in the passenger seat, a car seat he'd illegally purchased without a child to put in it weeks before, and drove away from the city lights, back into the consuming dark of the desert. He was now a kidnapper. For 48 hours, the state of Arizona erupted. An Amber Alert lit up every phone for 200 miles. The news cycles spun wild theories, a billionaire's twisted obsession, a custody battle gone rogue, a human trafficking scheme. The sheriff's department, led by Deputy Gonzalez, was furious and humiliated. They threw every resource at the case, but Ben Carter's wealth became a shield. He owned over 50 remote properties, airstrips, and bunkers. He wasn't using his credit cards or his phone. He had vanished into the very landscape he controlled. But he wasn't in a bunker. He was in a modest, forgotten line cabin on the farthest edge of his own ranch, a place without electricity or running water. And he was failing. Lily, traumatized by another sudden rupture, refused to eat. She cried a thin, weak cry that carved a hole straight through him. The formula dripped from her mouth. Her diaper rash bloomed angry and red. Ben, a man who had commanded thousands of head of cattle and a fortune in land, was brought to his knees by a 4-ounce bottle and a fever he couldn't break. He spent a night on a dirt floor, rocking her, singing off-key songs his own mother had forgotten, begging her to just swallow. On the third day, as the manhunt reached a fever pitch, a different kind of knock came at the cabin door. Not the police. It was Elena Reyes. She had used her knowledge of the desert backroads, the same ones she'd used to abandon Lily, to find him. She stood there, holding a bag of medical supplies, diaper cream, infant Tylenol, a proper bottle. "I saw the news," she said, her voice steady. "You're killing her with love, mister." She pushed past him, took one look at Lily, and got to work. In an hour, she had the baby fed, cleaned, and finally, peacefully asleep. An uneasy alliance was forged in that dusty cabin. Elena confessed everything. Her sister's boyfriend, the father, was a mid-level enforcer named Marco Valdez. The gang wasn't just a local threat, it was a transnational smuggling operation. Marco believed the baby was a liability, a genetic witness. The gang's leader had given the order: the child disappears permanently. Elena's original act of abandonment had been, in her shattered mind, an act of salvation, placing Lily where someone like Ben could find her, away from Marco's reach. Ben's very public fight for custody had painted a target on all of them. "They won't stop," she told him, bathing Lily in a plastic tub. "You have a fortune. They see a ransom or a message." The legal noose tightened from another direction. Judge Wilkins, livid at the breach of her court's authority, signed an order stripping Ben of all custody rights and charging him with felony kidnapping and endangerment. The press, smelling blood, turned. The Miracle Rancher headline was replaced with Billionaire Baby Snatcher. His business partners began to call, worried about stability. The state moved to freeze his assets, a process that would take time but was now inevitable. Ben's world was collapsing from the outside in, yet inside the cabin, a fragile routine began. Lily gained weight. She began to smile at the sound of Ben's voice. Elena, haunted by her own guilt, proved to be a natural, intuitive caregiver. The three of them became a fugitive family, bound by a crime and a child. The breaking point came from an unexpected quarter. Deputy Maria Gonzalez, following a hunch, re-interviewed the nurses from the NICU. One of them, finally breaking down under the stress, admitted she had seen Ben leave, but she also confessed something else. She had let him. She had turned off the door alarm. She had seen the look on his face, had read the same medical reports, and in a moment of quiet rebellion against a failing system, she had chosen mercy over protocol. This revelation changed everything. It wasn't a premeditated kidnapping, it was a desperate rescue aided by a complicit witness. The felony charge began to crack. But the law's hesitation was the gang's opportunity. Marco Valdez, released on bail for his other charges, knew time was running out. If Ben was arrested, the baby would go back into the system, a system with paper trails and social workers, harder to reach. He needed to act before the state did. His men began circling the outskirts of Ben's ranch, asking questions in town, buying information. They found the line cabin. Ben, checking perimeter sensors he'd rigged with solar alarms, saw the dust from their trucks 5 miles out. He had 20 minutes. What happened next was not a heroic stand, but a calculated retreat. Ben and Elena packed the truck with nothing but Lily's supplies. They didn't head for the highway. They drove deeper into the desert, into a maze of arroyos and mesas where Ben had mapped water sources decades before. They were going off-grid, not to hide from the law, but from a threat the law couldn't contain. As they bounced over rocks, Lily tucked safely against Elena's chest, Ben made a call on a satellite phone. He didn't call his lawyer. He called a private security consultant he'd used to protect his oil fields overseas. The message was simple: the asset is a 6-month-old girl. The threat is active and domestic. I need an extraction and a safe house. No police. The consultant's team intercepted them at a prearranged GPS coordinate, a dry riverbed. In a surreal, silent exchange under the blistering sun, Lily was transferred from Ben's truck to a nondescript van with reinforced panels. Elena, sobbing, chose to go with her. She was the only blood relative, the only person who could legally ride in that van with the child. Ben had to stay behind. He had to draw the fire. He watched the van disappear into the heat haze, his heart splitting in two. He was now alone again, but his purpose was clear. He turned his truck around and drove not away from the danger, but straight toward the main ranch house, where Marco Valdez and his men would undoubtedly come looking. He was going to use himself as bait. The ranch house was already occupied when Ben arrived. Marco Valdez and 2 of his men were waiting in his living room, their boots on the oak table he'd inherited from his grandfather. They hadn't broken in, they'd been let in by a ranch hand Marco had paid off. "The rich man returns," Marco said, not getting up. "Without the package." Ben stood in the doorway, the vast, vulnerable silence of his home pressing in. He had no security, no weapon within reach. He had only his name and his land, and at that moment, neither meant anything. Marco's proposition was simple, and it had nothing to do with ransom. "The girl is a problem. My boss wants the problem erased. You made her visible, now you make her disappear for good. You tell us where your little security team took her, we handle it. You get to walk away, keep your money, your land, no more cops at your door." Ben looked at the man's dead eyes and understood the true calculus. This wasn't about a baby. It was about power, about sending a message that no one, not even a billionaire, could interfere. Refusal meant his death, and they would find Lily anyway. He needed to buy time the van didn't have. So Ben lied. He gave them coordinates to an abandoned mining site 50 miles north, a place with enough infrastructure to plausibly be a safe house. He spun a story about a bunker, armed guards, a scheduled move at dawn. He made it complex, detailed, feeding on their greed for a clean solution. Marco studied him, then nodded to his men. They grabbed Ben, bound his wrists, and threw him in the trunk of their own car. Insurance policy, Marco said, slamming the lid shut. If this is a trick, you die first, then we find the aunt, then the baby. The drive to the mining site was a nightmare of heat and gasoline fumes, but Ben had a single advantage. He knew this land in his bones. He knew the road had a sharp, unguarded bend 2 miles from the site where the shoulder crumbled into a deep arroyo. As the car slowed for the turn, Ben began kicking rhythmically against the trunk's internal latch, a weak point he'd known about but never thought he'd use. On the third kick, just as the driver accelerated out of the bend, the latch gave. The trunk flew open, and Ben, bound and blind, rolled out into the darkness. He hit the ground hard, tumbling down the steep embankment into a dry creek bed, the sound of the car's engine fading into the night. He was free, but he was alone in the desert with broken ribs, no water, and no way to contact his security team or warn Elena. The safe house protocol was radio silent for 72 hours. Lily was beyond his reach, and the gang now knew his lie had a short shelf life. He began to walk, following the stars south, toward the only person he thought might listen, Deputy Maria Gonzalez. He would turn himself in, not for the kidnapping, but for the greater crime of putting a target on a child. He would trade his freedom for a police raid on Marco's known operations, a distraction to draw heat away from the real safe house. Meanwhile, in a nondescript suburban house in Tucson, the safe house was failing. The security consultant had placed Elena and Lily with a retired couple, former clients. It was sterile, quiet, and secure. But Elena, jumpy and paranoid, saw threats in every passing car. She insisted on moving rooms twice in one night. On the second day, she broke protocol. Consumed by guilt and a desperate need for reassurance, she used a burner phone Ben had given her. Not to call him, his phone was off, but to call her old church to speak to a priest. The call lasted 47 seconds. It was enough. Marco's crew, monitoring all known associates of Elena, had the church phone tapped. They traced the burner's signal to a cell tower in Tucson. They didn't have an address, but they had a neighborhood. They flooded the area with lookouts, watching for any sign of a baby, a nervous woman, or extra security. The net was closing not through force, but through Elena's fragile hope. Ben, bleeding and delirious, stumbled onto a state highway at dawn. A trucker picked him up and called the police. Within an hour, he was in an interrogation room facing Deputy Gonzalez and a furious state prosecutor. But Ben wasn't asking for a lawyer. He was giving them Marco Valdez. He gave up everything: the meeting at the ranch, the mining site lie, the gang's structure, their boss's name, a shadowy figure known only as El Silencio. He gave them the motive: the elimination of a blood witness. In exchange, he demanded one thing: immediate, overwhelming police action against Marco's crew to pull them away from Tucson. He presented it not as a deal, but as a tactical necessity to save a child's life. The authorities moved, but not in the way Ben hoped. Judge Wilkins was brought in. She saw Ben's confession not as a heroic turn, but as proof of the chaos he'd unleashed. A SWAT team was dispatched to raid Marco's operations, yes, but a separate order was signed. Every police resource in Tucson was also activated to find that safe house and take Lily into *protective custody. The state was now racing the gang to the same location. The child had become the grand prize in a three-way war between the law, the criminals, and one broken rancher. In Tucson, the lookout spotted a curtain moving in an upstairs window of a quiet house. He saw a woman holding a baby. He called it in. Marco, enraged by the police raids on his warehouses, decided on a brutal, direct play. He wouldn't wait. He and two men stormed the house in broad daylight, shooting out the front door lock. The retired husband was pistol-whipped. The security consultant, who was outside in a surveillance van, was ambushed. Elena heard the commotion, grabbed Lily, and ran to the only hiding place she could find, a crawlspace access panel in the closet ceiling. She shoved Lily into the dark, dusty space, then slid in after her, pulling the panel closed just as the bedroom door burst open. Downstairs, the gang found nothing. They were tearing the place apart when the first police sirens wailed in the distance. The Tucson PD, guided by the cell tower ping, was minutes away. Marco, screaming in frustration, ordered his men to torch the house. If we can't have her, no one does. Gasoline was splashed in the hallway. A match was struck. As the men fled, the first flames licked up the curtains in the living room. In the crawl space, Elena heard the crackle, felt the heat seep through the floorboards. Smoke began to coil into the tight space. Lily, sensing the terror, began to whimper. Elena covered the baby's mouth with her hand, tears cutting through the grime on her face. They were trapped, and the world was burning down around them. The first firefighter through the door wasn't looking for survivors, he was looking for a body. The blaze had consumed the lower floor, and the heat was a physical wall. But a neighbor, who had seen the gang storm the house, told police a woman and a baby were inside. Upstairs, in a smoke-filled hallway, a firefighter's boot broke through a weakened section of floor. Beneath it, in the crawl space, he saw movement. Elena, using her own body as a shield, had covered Lily with a wet towel and was desperately fanning air through a tiny gap in the insulation. They were pulled out just as the ceiling collapsed. Both were alive, but Lily was unconscious from smoke inhalation. At the hospital, a different battle began. Lily was stabilized, but the trauma was cumulative. Abandonment, multiple separations, and now near death by fire. A team of pediatric specialists noted she had stopped crying altogether. She simply stared, a condition known as quiet trauma. Elena, treated for burns and smoke inhalation, was immediately arrested and charged with felony child endangerment and conspiracy. Ben, still in custody, was charged with kidnapping, but the DA, facing public outrage over the burning house, added a new charge: reckless endangerment resulting in grievous bodily harm. The media narrative solidified. A billionaire's selfish crusade had almost killed the child he claimed to save. But in the ashes, new evidence emerged. The security consultant, who survived the ambush, provided recordings of Marco Valdez ordering the hit on the house. The retired couple confirmed Elena had hidden the baby at great personal risk. The nurse from the NICU came forward publicly, stating she had helped Ben because the system was failing Lily. Public sentiment, fueled by dramatic footage of the rescue, began to turn. An online petition for justice for Lily gathered over 100,000 signatures in 2 days. The story was no longer about a crime. It was about a broken system that left a baby with no safe harbor. Facing political pressure, the district attorney offered a deal. In exchange for her testimony against Marco Valdez and the gang's leadership, all charges against Elena would be dropped. She would also voluntarily relinquish any custodial claim to Lily, a condition she accepted through tears. "I am her past," she told the judge. "She needs a future." Ben's case was more complex. His kidnapping charge was reduced to a misdemeanor, given the nurse's testimony and the extenuating circumstances. But the endangerment charge stood. His sentence: 5 years of probation, a $200,000 fine, and a permanent bar from ever adopting Lily. The judge's words were final: "You cannot save a child by setting the world on fire." With Elena out of the picture and Ben legally barred, Lily became a ward of the state once more. But the caseworker assigned to her, a woman named Susan Park, who had followed the saga from the beginning, made an unconventional recommendation. The state's goal was a forever home, but every potential family was a stranger. Susan petitioned the court for a temporary foster placement with the only constant in Lily's life: Deputy Maria Gonzalez. Maria, who had chased Ben, arrested Elena, and coordinated the rescue, had held Lily in the ambulance. The baby, for the first time in hours, had stopped shaking. The court, in an unprecedented move, agreed. Maria became Lily's emergency foster mother. Ben, stripped of his chance to parent, returned to his ranch a changed man. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was a condemnation. He sold off 20,000 acres of land and used the proceeds, nearly $30 million, to establish the Lily Foundation. Its mission: to fund rapid response medical and legal teams for infants in crisis within the foster system and to support safe haven programs nationwide. He never put his name on it. The foundation's letterhead bore a single image: a desert lily. He worked on it every day, a penance and a purpose. He did not contact Maria or try to see Lily. He honored the law, but he filled the silence with the work of making sure no other child would fall through the cracks. Lily, in Maria's home, began the slow journey back. She was diagnosed with an attachment disorder. She didn't know how to trust that a caregiver would stay. Maria, a single woman who had dedicated her life to the law, now dedicated it to teaching one small girl that the world could be safe. It took 6 months for Lily to laugh, a year before she would let Maria out of her sight. The court mandated supervised visits with Alina, now a key witness in protective custody, which were heartbreaking but necessary. Alina would bring small gifts, sing songs, and always say goodbye with the words, "I love you and I am so sorry." 2 years passed. Ben's foundation had already saved dozens of children. He received a letter from the court. His probation was being reviewed for early termination due to exemplary conduct and civic contribution. Attached was a separate personal note from Judge Wilkins. It read, "The law deals in absolutes, life does not. Your foundation's work is noted, so is your restraint. A child is not a prize to be won, but a person to be raised. Do you understand the difference now?" Ben framed the note. He didn't seek early termination. He served his full probation, a daily reminder of the cost of his choices. On Lily's third birthday, Maria Gonzalez filed papers to adopt her. The process was swift, supported by glowing reports from therapists and teachers. The adoption hearing was a quiet affair, but as the judge was about to sign the final order, Maria stood and asked to address the court. "Your Honor," she said, "this child has a family that is larger than one person. She has an aunt who saved her life by letting her go. She has a man who, despite his mistakes, gave her a foundation that will protect children for generations. I believe it is in Lily's best interest to know the full story of her resilience. Therefore, I formally request that the court approve a plan for ongoing, structured contact with both Alina Reyes and Ben Carter, in whatever capacity a child psychologist deems healthy." The judge approved. The terms were strict, supervised therapy-guided visits, with Maria having final veto power. The first meeting between Ben and Lily in 3 years took place in a sunny playroom at a therapist's office. Ben, now grey at the temples, knelt on the floor. Lily, holding Maria's hand, stared at him. He didn't reach for her. He simply opened a small box. Inside was a carved wooden horse, much like the one from his own childhood. "I heard you like horses," he said, his voice thick. Lily looked at Maria, who nodded. She took the horse. She didn't call him anything, but she smiled. The final, surprising detail emerged from a DNA test. As part of the adoption process, Maria had Lily's ancestry analyzed. The results showed no genetic link to Marco Valdez. The violent man who had ordered her death was not her biological father. Her real father was likely a migrant worker who had passed through months before, unaware of his daughter's existence. The terrifying shadow that had chased Lily from birth was a fiction, a phantom threat born of one man's paranoia. She had never been a loose end to the gang. She had been a prop in a power struggle. The revelation was a crushing relief. Today, Lily is a thriving 7-year-old. She calls Maria Mom. She sees Alina, who now works as a counselor for at-risk mothers, every month. She calls her Tia Aunt. And Ben Carter, the rancher who started it all, is Uncle Ben. He visits on birthdays and holidays, always bringing a gift for the foundation in her name. The 3 adults, bound by tragedy, have forged an unorthodox but enduring alliance for her sake. The desert road where it began is now marked by a small, state-funded, safe haven sign directing desperate parents to a nearby fire station. It was paid for by the Lily Foundation. The ranch still stands, and the sign at the gate no longer reads "private property." It says, "This is a place where lost things are found." So what is the true legacy of a child found crying on a desert road? It is not a simple story of rescue. It is a complicated map of human failure and human courage drawn in the dust. It asks us the hardest questions. When does protection become possession? When does a system designed for safety become a cage? And what do we owe to the most vulnerable among us, not in theory, but in the chaotic, messy reality of a single life? Lily's story redefines family. It is not defined by a single signature on an adoption paper, but by a constellation of choices. A rancher who chose to stop his truck, an aunt who chose to confess, a deputy who chose to foster, a judge who chose to allow connection over strict isolation. Each choice was imperfect, each carried a cost, but together they wove a net strong enough to catch a life that was falling. The Lily Foundation, born from a billionaire's guilt and grief, has now helped safely place over 300 infants through improved safe haven protocols and funded legal advocates for children in the foster system. The ranch that was a fortress is now a symbol. The desert road that was a place of abandonment now has a sign pointing toward hope. The trauma is not erased. Lily will carry those early scars always, but it has been surrounded by a resilience built by many hands. This case exposed a fatal flaw in our thinking, the belief that for every child in crisis, there is one perfect solution, one right home waiting to be found. The truth is far messier. Sometimes salvation is a mosaic. Sometimes the village it takes is not a metaphor, but a specific, flawed, and determined group of people who refuse to look away. In the end, we are left with a picture not of a hero, but of a community forged in fire. A former criminal who found redemption in counseling others, a lawman who became a mother, a wealthy man who found his purpose in giving his wealth away, and a little girl who by her very survival taught them all that love is not about ownership, but about showing up again and again, no matter how you got there. The desert remembers nothing. It swallows footprints and stories with equal indifference, but people can choose to remember. They can choose to build something in the barren places. Lily's story endures because it is not a fairy tale. It is a blueprint, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is not to follow the rules, but to repair the world one broken, beautiful life at a time. If this story changed your perspective on family, on justice, or on second chances, let us know in the comments. Share this documentary with someone who needs to see that redemption is possible. And subscribe for more deep dives into the real stories that challenge everything we think we know. Because the world is full of silent roads, and sometimes, if we listen closely, we can still hear the echoes of a cry that changed everything.